Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Christian Channel Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Kelly, and today we're joined by someone who's become a familiar voice in the traditional Christian world, especially in the online space. Nick Cavazos is the creator and host of the Traditional Thomist, a YouTube channel devoted to exploring the timeless wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas, the beauty of the Christian tradition, and how both can be lived out in the modern world. He's a regular guest on the Avoiding Babylon podcast and part of a growing movement of young Christians reclaiming reverence, reason, and the deep spiritual heritage of the church. Nick is known for his clarity, charity, and his ability to take on challenging topics with both conviction and humility. Whether he's breaking down the Thomistic philosophy or addressing current issues in the church, he's become a thoughtful and articulate voice in today's Christians conversation. Nick, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you guys for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Nick, let's start at the beginning. Can you walk us through your personal journey of your faith? What led you to the Christian church and eventually to embracing traditional Catholicism through the lens of a Thomist?
Sure. I was baptized in the Catholic Church, I think 3 months, around 3 months old, something like that. And my family, though, left pretty soon after that point. My family kind of came from what's called a mixed marriage, mixed not in the sense of an ethnic group, but mixed in the religious sense. My mom was a part of a conservative Baptist denomination. My father was, let's just say, kind of a cultural cafeteria Catholic. And so they had me baptized in the church. But it's very common for Catholics out there to believe in a false teaching, which is one's Catholic, always Catholic. By virtue of your baptism, you're always Catholic. That's not actually true. And so I, for all intents and purposes, am a convert. It was in 2020 that I converted to the church after spending most of my life in evangelicalism. And evangelicalism, it's kind of such a panoply of different perspectives. There's very conservative, even sometimes Calvinistic evangelical circles, and then there's on the other end of the spectrum, Pentecostal style charismatics. And I kind of came from a flavor of both. My church kind of was a mix of both of them. But long story short, I ended up converting my way into the church because I did a lot of reading. I've always been interested in theology and history, and those two subjects kind of go hand in hand. And so it was fairly soon into actually like going back and studying the early Christian writings, which sometimes known today as the Church Fathers colloquially, but in more proper respects, the patristics. Going and studying their writings, being convicted that Catholicism was indeed the true religion. So that's the short version of the story. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. And 6 years on now being Catholic, it's funny because I recently went to a friend's wedding of mine who's not a Catholic, and I was just kind of amazed of how different my mindset has shifted from those days.
Oh, wow. So you would say your growth really came from, I mean, you love Jesus. You've been to evangelical churches, and then you really found home in the Catholic Church. That's awesome. As someone who's come to embrace tradition at a young age, what have been some of the biggest challenges and graces along the path?
Yeah, the biggest challenges I think are to your own interior life because, we can have suffering from the outside of, our circles and from the world and things along that nature, but that's just part of the Christian life. Suffering is innate to the Christian life. St. Peter talks about in his first epistle how suffering, our Lord suffered and gave us an example on how to suffer well. And so I would say the real suffering, though, and the real challenges that people will come into contact is that if they do cooperate with God's grace, they're going to see very, very quickly how imperfect we are, right? They're going to see very much so the horror and the hideousness that is sin. But in tandem, the greatest graces that come with that is recognizing that even though you are a sinner, and then as St. Paul talks about, even an enemy of God, it is still God who loves you. Not just loves you in kind of a speculative sense where you can kind of rationalize it with your mind, but he actually loves you as an individual person. And if you were the only person on planet Earth, God would still want to redeem you. And of course, you can wrestle with these things, as I often do, things kind of like when St. Augustine would wrestle and say, Lord, I don't understand why this infinitely just and infinitely good God would love someone who's not good and not just and not holy. And yet, that is part of the mystery that is God's everlasting and infinite love. God is not a being that has love as kind of a characteristic outside of himself. God is love. himself. And so therefore he cannot do other than just love us, which is really wonderful.
No, it's great. You said it. You said it almost as good as my homily yesterday for the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Have you thought about becoming a priest or getting into that realm of Catholicism, or is it not in the scope of reality for you?
Yeah, I thought about it for a while, a couple years ago, but I've discerned out of that world, and so I think I'm very much so called to the natural state that is holy matrimony.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So all the ladies out there, they they know you're available, right?
I am available. We'll see what happens.
You're often associated with the SSPX. For listeners who may not be familiar, could you explain what drew you to the society and how is it different from other expressions of Catholicism within the church today?
Sure, yeah. So it's interesting that I'm kind of associated nowadays with the SSPX because I've more or less just defended them in some respects, but apparently myself and my friend Kennedy Hall are kind of like the big people on YouTube that are known for defending the SSPX. So short version, the SSPX is a order of religious priests inside of the Catholic Church. Its mission is merely just to pass on the deposit of faith and to form good priests. That's essentially all that it is. And so, what that entails, of course, is the whole traditional regiment of everything from classic studies in ascetical and mystical theology, philosophy, dogmatics, moral theology, canon law, etc., and then going out and being priests. The SSPX has had, let's just say, legal issues with the church as a whole, mostly because of politics, internal church politics. And so oftentimes they get unjustly accused of being schismatic or from being outside of the church. All people have to do to in that debate is merely look at what Rome in her official capacity has said, not what random church prelates or YouTubers say, but what has Rome in her official capacity said. And Rome, her official capacity in the Ecclesia Dei Commission has ruled that the SSPX is in fact not in schism. They are part of the church. You can go to their masses. You can go and have your Sunday and holy day of obligation fulfilled. You can go and receive confession. You can even donate and send your children to school. They are just considered canonically irregular. Canonically irregular just means in the context of canon church law, you don't have an official place. You're in the team, but we just don't know where to put you on the team, if that's a good analogy for people. And so I was drawn to traditional Catholicism in the same manner that I became Catholic in general, which was just a study of history and a study of church doctrine. And I realized that a lot of the issues that we face right now inside of the church, unfortunately, they're rooted in philosophies and even certain theologies that are alien to the deposit of faith and unfortunately have been kind of, let's just say, dabbled with over the last 60 years and didn't need to be. And unfortunately, it was really the SSPX for the longest time that was the only show in town that was ever putting any resistance to that.
Mm, mm. Okay, all right. It's very interesting. I'm not very familiar with SSPX, and like the first thing you do when you Google SSPX, you're like, is like I do, like with ChatGPT, is it communion with the Roman Catholic Church? And ChatGPT says no. But do you think you ever see a day where SSPX, the society, could ever join the, be in communion with the Catholic Church? Is that something, you're hopeful for?
Well, yeah, I would say that they are in communion, but if what you mean by communion is will they ever have an official place in the context of canon law? Yes, I do think eventually, because what's funny is the common arguments that you're seeing across the spectrum of influencers, regardless of like their particular flavor of Catholicism, all of them in some form or fashion are starting to make SSPX similar arguments. I mean, really, especially under the Pope Francis pontificate, the amount of times people were just scratching their heads and saying, what's going on and confusing. I mean, the society walked that road a long time ago with Paul VI and John Paul II. And so I do think eventually there will be. However, the SSPX is principled in the sense that for them to receive a personal prelature or canonical recognition, their big goal is really the following at the moment. One, that the Latin Mass be restored worldwide in the sense that all priests of the Roman Rite be able to say it. According to their ordination, they have the right to say it. And then secondly, that the doctrinal confusions that were inserted into the Second Vatican Council in areas such as religious liberty, ecumenism, and collegiality be cleaned up. Not saying that they of course, believe that the council is, in fact, a legitimate and valid ecumenical council. However, they recognize that in some of these documents of a non-infallible nature, there are sometimes positive errors, sometimes ambiguous statements that oftentimes have been used by really, let's just say, heretical movements inside of the church these days, for the destruction of many souls. And so that's kind of the line that the SSPX has to see Rome cross before an official recognition can take place.
Okay. So we have quite a ways to get there.
You got away, yeah.
Okay. You've been a recurring guest on the Avoiding Babylon podcast. How does that relationship start? And what is it like being a part of that wider conversation? And how do you balance your honest critique with charity? Because I see you on the podcast, and I see Rob and I see Anthony, and it's a lot of fun, right? You have a lot of fun guests on that show. So how did that relationship start? And I always love it when you come on, because you're kind of like you are the official, like, their version of the voice of reason, right? It's
Oh,
like,
really?
I think so. I think so. You have Anthony and you have Rob, and Anthony's the wild card and Rob's kind of reeling them back in, and then you come in and say, "Guys, let me take it from here." That's
Okay,
my
yeah.
that's my outside commentary.
Sure, yeah. It started, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, although I've only been really broadly involved with them for two. But it started a while back, on a different show. It's called The Meaning of Catholic, and it's basically a kind of quasi-academic channel where Catholics from all different stripes come together and make contributions. And at the time, they were hosting their really, really low-key game show. Like it was just very, very funny. It's like the production value was horrible. You would open up the video, Anthony would be blasting with his iPhone next to the monitor, some horrible like 70s hymn, and then they would just do Catholic trivia, and it was kind of just a place for people to unwind and laugh. And I went on the first show that we all kind of premiered on, and won by default, which was very, very funny. And what ended up taking place after that is they just had me on just to kind of have a conversation, something similar to this. And what eventually happened is I guess they enjoyed my commentary, so they started inviting me on more and more, and I became a fairly regular contributor on there. So it's pretty good. And then as far as balancing truth and charity, of course, are never truly opposed to one another, because you can see in 1 Corinthians 13 that St. Paul says that charity does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. So any supposed love that a Christian has out there that's not actually calling out sin and wanting people to be rescued from that is, in fact, a false love, a false charity. And so for me, what it is I think you first have to start with humility and recognize that you are messed up yourself and you need God's grace yourself. And therefore, sometimes you have to tailor your advice as if you were giving it to yourself. And so sometimes that requires kind of a swift kick in the pants, and then at other times it requires you sitting down and just having a conversation with somebody or walking with them. So each situation is different, but I think always at the end of the day, if you keep the mindset, I want to go to heaven, I want to be a saint, I want to honor Christ with what I do, then I need to watch my words, I need to watch how I behave, I need to actually conform my own mind to the deposit of faith, as opposed to letting my own opinions dictate everything.
Wow. Yeah, very good point. And I've been noticing that just outside commentary with, like, when I go to confession. Like, I went to confession yesterday. It was a Sacred Heart of Jesus, and I just saw the line filled with young people, like just like
Mhm.
yourself. And I just think there has to be a connection between Catholic YouTubers and just, I've been Catholic my whole life, but I've never seen so many young Catholics going to confession prior to receiving the Eucharist. Because, I'm going to name drop. I was at an event with Mark Wahlberg's brother, Jim Wahlberg, and they came out with this movie called Jesus Thirst. And Jim pretty much said, I've been a Catholic my whole life, and he has a beautiful story where he met Mother Teresa. But one key point that he'd said that really stood out to me was, like, if we truly believe this is Jesus Christ, like, we have to participate in the faith. What does that mean? We have to go to confession. And so I think you and everybody at Avoiding Babylon, I think, we're all, we're not perfect podcasters, but maybe one day we'll be Rogan, so
Sure. Mhm.
and catechize the world. Let's zoom out a bit. In this turbulent culture and political movement, many Christians are unsure of how to respond, and how can the framework of Thomistic philosophy help us navigate in today's challenges with clarity, truth, and charity?
Sure. So St. Pius X, when he was going to war against the what he calls the synthesis, or more properly translated, the sewer of all heresies, modernism, he
Mm.
said that the antidote to modernism is the theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And it's because St. Thomas Aquinas is someone who is, if you will, a disciple of moderate realism. He recognizes that there is, in fact, reality. But then, more even important than just the natural reality around us, there is God's divine revelation, the divine revelation of the deposit of faith, and even more so, the divine revelation of his Son and of who he is. And so, right now, our entire modern world is engulfed in modernism. When I say modernism, I don't mean they like cars or technology or modern trappings. That's not what I mean. What I mean by modernism, if you had to define it very shortly, it is basically this belief that religion is not, in fact, something that's given by God. Religion has as its origin point our internal dispositions. And so basically, how we feel about religion is what religion is. So if I want to worship the flying spaghetti monster, therefore it is true. But that philosophy of, if you will, subjectivism, which says I will impose my internal religious or even internal sentiments on the world, we see that mentality everywhere. We see that in religion, where we see religion needs to be tailored for modern man's needs. So let's embrace the rainbow movement. Let's embrace contraception. Let's embrace abortion, right? Because modern man wants this, therefore that must be good in God's sight. We see this in the secular world as well, in no better area than in the world of transgenderism, which says, I feel this way, therefore I am, right? That is literally just modernism, but wrapped up in a philosophical sense. And so St. Thomas Aquinas is the antidote, because what he does is he conforms you in the realm of philosophy back to what nature is. No, you have an innate nature as a male or as a female. And then he grounds these things underneath the greater truth, which is God's divine revelation. The fact that we, as human creatures, have an end, we have a purpose in this life. Our purpose is to know, love, and serve God, and to be with Him in the next life. So if one goes and studies St. Thomas Aquinas, you'll find two things happen. One, you'll debunk, if you will, the errors of the modern world. But then also, you will find your intellect becoming extremely clear. And it's funny, people oftentimes, whenever you go through like freshman philosophy in college, they always come out and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I hate my life now. I'm questioning everything." I always joke with them, I think you're just reading the wrong philosophy, right? If you read good philosophy, you will look around and say, the world finally makes sense. And that's what St. Thomas will do for you.
Oh, wow. Any specific books from St. Thomas Aquinas that could help, our audience kind of understand that deep meaning of faith?
Sure. If you're really new to St. Thomas, don't jump into one of his major writings, because you will be left confused. But I would say, for people who are first checking out St. Thomas, three works. Number one, go and check out Dr. Taylor Marshall's like 50-page introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas. You can find that for free online. Second, if you're wanting more of a standard book, the Summa of the Summa by Dr. Peter Kreeft is a really good work. It's basically a short commentary of the first two parts of St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae. And then the third one is Father Paul Glenn's A Tour of the Summa, which, if you decide to read St. Thomas's Summa, what that is it's basically a commentary of St. Thomas's Summa, but what it does is it just gives you the entire synopsis of any given chapter in one paragraph form, which I think for new beginners, that's a good amount for what they need.
All right. All right. The links will be in the description below. It sounds very interesting. When I think of Catholic YouTubers, I often wonder about the deeper spiritual side of what they do, specifically the call to imitate Christ while living in such a public role. For you personally, what does striving for holiness look like in your day-to-day life, especially as someone active in the online media? And how do you guard your interior life and stay grounded while remaining present in the public square?
Yeah, you nailed it when you said the phrase imitate Christ, because that's the core of Christianity that I think oftentimes we completely miss. Oftentimes we can focus, or maybe this is just Nick, but I can at least focus on, you believe the right things. That's true, right? You need to do that. Or you do the right things. That's good. You need to do that. But ultimately, we have to be imitators of Christ. Disciple of Christ means that he is the master. We are the students. We learn of how he moves and walks and breathes and lives, and we imitate that. Practically, then, therefore, how that works in my case is the biggest way for me is attacking my predominant fault, right? we need to all ask ourselves the question, what is the sin that I am bringing up all the time in the confessional? Right? There's that one sin that you guys all know that you're all bringing up all the time, and you're always kind of struggling with it, right? And you feel down about yourself. Well, the reality is that yeah, by your own strength, you cannot get rid of that sin. By your own strength, you can't even atone for one venial sin. What you need is God's grace. And so, whatever that predominant fault you have in the confessional is, focus on just practicing the opposite virtue of that. So, if you struggle with lust, practice chastity. If you struggle with anger, strive for meekness. If you struggle with pride, go after humility. That's what you have to do. And so, for me, practically, it's attacking those predominant faults and it's engaging in actions of prayer. So, for instance, in my interior life, what I struggle or strive for is things along the nature of, am I making sure I'm getting 30 minutes a day at least of mental prayer? Am I continuing to pray the breviary, which is something I'm actually required to do? Am I praying the rosary every day? Not just praying these things in the sense of just more is good, but in the sense of if I use these tools as means of communion with God, that's the most important thing. So I'd say focus on prayer for a lot of people, as well as the things that you're just required to do out of love of God. Things like going to Mass every Sunday and holy days of obligation, going to confession. I would recommend people, especially in this modern world, go weekly, every single week, and really be picking away at your sin.
Awesome. In your experience, especially online, what are some common misconceptions Catholics have about the Latin Mass, the church traditions, or even the SSPX? What do you wish people understood?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to the whole of it, I would say there are some stereotypes and there's some, unfortunately, things that are true. So I think one thing that most people assume is that we're all just really angry and bitter and that we all hate the Pope and things along that nature. Now, I will say there, of course, with every stereotype, there is a hint of truth. There are people out there who genuinely, at least especially under the Pope Francis pontificate, they would just blast every single thing he said. And they had no charity. They never prayed for him or things like that. But I would say if you actually go to a traditional Latin Mass community as opposed to just seeing comments online, what you will find is, as you said, lots of young people as well as lots of large families. And the reality is what for most people, especially like in the world of the society, it's just people who want to be Catholic in the same way that every single Catholic was going back until time immemorial was, right? It's not individuals who want to go out there and be rogue. It's just genuinely people who are wanting to strive after holiness according to their state in life. So I
Mhm.
would say for people broadly in the church, what I would challenge them to do is really investigate the claim. Is in fact the SSPX in schism? And why is it the fact that Rome has said, no, it is not in schism? They've said this multiple times. Why is it that, for instance, and maybe another good question, why is it, for instance, that you'll find heretical priests running around teaching all kinds of issues when it comes to moral issues, right? Who openly embrace sodomy or openly embrace some heretical teaching, but yet the Latin Mass parish down the road's getting canceled, even though it's one of the most popular masses in town. We have to start asking ourselves the question, and then also at the same time, kind of holding lovingly our shepherds accountable and saying, your job is to pass on the deposit of faith. It's not to be the CEO of Catholic Inc. in your neck of the woods. It's to pass on the deposit of faith so that souls can be saved. So if that's the case, why is this priest over here having a rainbow banner in his church while the priest 3 blocks down who's holding the solemn TLM is being canceled? So I would say for people, recognize most Catholics are just wanting to practice the faith as they were always did. And if they're angst about stuff, it's typically because of a just cause that's going on in their area or they're seeing online.
Mhm. Mhm. In your neck of the woods, are you seeing like more of a persecution? I know like there's some parts in Texas near Austin where it tends to get a little more liberal and you see a lot of aggression against the traditionalists. Is what would be your commentary? Like, what would be your guidance? Because there's some parts of the country where, like Charlotte, which is kind of known for its like traditionalism, and then you have a bishop who just wants to cancel it. Like, I'm not saying we can solve this in one evening or one podcast, but if you
Hmm.
had to close with, if you're sitting down in front of a Christian who's wrestling with doubts, disillusions, and discouragements, what would you say to help them rediscover the beauty and truth of the faith?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess since that's kind of two part, in my neck of the woods in Texas, yes, we've seen insane persecutions. When I came into the church, was part of a diocesan TLM community that had about 800 families. We were all at the cathedral in Austin, St. Mary's Cathedral, and we were promptly shut down after the motu proprio. And that took away about, let's just say, a good 60% of the parish, right? It was out on the street. And we were moved to a number of different, let's just say, halls, like church halls. We can't be in the church, but we can be in a hall somewhere, like 50 feet away, which is pretty weird because then you oftentimes have Catholics who go to the new mass, they're walking by and they're like, why can my friend not come into mass here? That's really weird. And so, but unfortunately, many of those halls have been canceled since that time by Rome. And so a lot of Catholics have just moved on to the world of the SSPX because we know that it won't be canceled in that context and that we'll have prelates who are trying to fight for our rights.
Mm.
But as for your second question about rediscovering the truth, I would say, on this, if you will, in this octave of the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, if you keep Christ's love as the forefront of your life and you recognize that in your faults and in your shortcomings and your sin, even in the stuff that, let's just be honest, you would never ever want to share with anybody else, Christ still will accept you if you have true contrition and repentance. And he loves you and he wants to be with you. And so keep that first and foremost as the core. But then recognize that all of the truths of faiths, both in dogma and in morals and the disciplines and like the prayers and the chaplets that you pray, all of those should flow from, first and foremost, God's love for you, and then you can receive them and give, if you will, your assent and your practice to those things out of love of God. And so I would say if you're wanting to rediscover the beauty of faith, I would say first sit down and really wrestle with the question, what is the true love of God? And ask the Lord in prayer, inflame my soul that it might love thee more. That's what I would ask people to do.
Wow, beautiful. Nick, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a real gift to hear your story, your insight, and the way you're helping others think more deeply about the faith. Before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to share or promote, maybe an upcoming project, a video series, or where people could find your work?
Sure, yeah. So people can find my work over here on YouTube at the Traditional Thomist, and they can also find me on Avoiding Babylon. As for social medias, I don't really do a ton of social media outside of just some fun stuff on Instagram. So if you guys want to check me out on Instagram, it's just under the Traditional Thomist. And then finally, everyone keep me in your prayers because I can't really spill the beans fully yet. But let's just say in the Catholic media circuit, there is going to be a very positive, but major shift up coming in August. I can't say fully what that is, but let's just say it is going to take the internet by storm. It's going to surprise a lot of people, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So keep me as well as you can just pray for about 6 other well-known Catholic names, but I can't divulge who they are, that will be joining in some pretty cool efforts.
That's awesome. And is that a movie project, TV show, or just
I
podcast?
I can't really say fully what it
Okay.
is, but let's
All
just
right.
say when it comes out, I'll send you a link,
Okay.
and you'll probably be pretty interested.
Awesome. All right. We'll be sure to link everything in the description below. So if you're watching or listening, definitely check out Nick's channel, The Traditional Thomist, and support the work he's doing there. As always, if this episode blessed you, share it with a friend, leave a review, and subscribe to the Christian Channel Podcast for more conversations that brings faith, culture, and truth together. Nick, God bless you. Thank you again for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And everyone tuning in, we'll see you next time.